This is not an orc. However, for some reason when I looked at this miniature, I thought it looks pretty decent in blue. I think it could look even better in green. The only question is, how am I going to take my incredibly limited amount of bits and turn them into an orc? But before I could get started on that, I first needed to destroy my paint job. And warning, Ultramarine fans might want to turn away for this one. With this orc de-bluified, it was time to pick up my hedge trimmers and rip off his very strange tiny looking head. What's even better is the way this miniature is designed, I'll essentially be creating a true scale orc. How awesome is that? All that was left to do was try to pick out a head that would naturally match the orc aesthetic, not to mention this model. This led me to try all of 13 heads that I had. I have no idea why I have so many, but I landed on the one that looks surprisingly decent. With my incredibly limited bits, I only had 3 arms that I thought would match the model aesthetic. And given that they all started at the shoulders, I had to make the first cut. The only problem is, once I make this cut, there's absolutely no going back and no second going, so I really have to make sure that it's in the right place. Unfortunately, my camera just could not face this horrible thing happening to this miniature, so it became blurry. I compared the last 2 arms I was really thinking about, before deciding that this one would work surprisingly well. And with this cut, I needed to start on a fresh slate, which was when I found one of my favorite looking orc heads that had rolled off the table. It's featured on one of the coolest orc artworks, however, it just did not match this model aesthetic, so unfortunately, I had to revert to the old one. I filled in the slot with a generous amount of sprue glue to ensure that when I attach it, it'll provide the most natural fit. The little neck stuff that was left over from the original head was actually very useful for attaching this one, and all I had to do was just remove this extra little flap. Then I filled in the gap between the head and the body to simulate sort of a neck effect. With the head fully attached, I was starting to believe that this could actually work out to be a really awesome looking orc. The elegance of the 2 pieces ensured that the natural anatomy of the muscles would actually align really well between them. Even though they are from different kits, from different models, from different universes, the muscle anatomy matches surprisingly well. With the sprue glue filling in the additional gaps that were left on by the Paint Boys' crude work of attaching this incredibly awesome looking prosthetic. And a good slugga needs some additional slugs to make sure that we actually can do some damage. Not to mention, it is going to make for an incredible looking belt buckle that will make the envy of other orcs. While Kommandos don't typically wear shoulder pads, I think in this case I have to give them at least a little bit of armor. But what Kommandos do wear are some pretty interesting backpacks, and after dry fitting this, I realized that I was going to have to either cut into the model or the backpack itself. While I considered giving this backpack some straps, I realized that my skill is just nowhere near enough to make them look authentic and not stand out like a sore thumb. Instead, I'll be giving him a pair of shoulder pads and create the idea that the backpack is actually hanging off of them instead. The shoulder pads are of course bolted into the orc himself because that's something that an orc would think of as a good solution to the problem. So to ensure that it doesn't accidentally rip off during the painting process, I filled it in with a generous amount of sprue glue. And for the second shoulder pad, going for the scrappy looking one. While I was incredibly skeptical whether any of these pieces would actually even fit the model, somehow with every single piece it seemed to go on incredibly naturally. Maybe whoever made this was actually intending to convert it into a pretty cool orc as well. I was enjoying this whole process so much that I wanted to give him some additional details. Starting off with a few crack booms. Next up, I wanted to give his slugga a pretty nice looking optic. What I didn't expect was, because this optic was designed to go on a very different kind of sight, it just did not want to go there. But I did remember that it was making an orc, so as long as he believes it's straightforward, it is. With him having no extra pockets, I did give him an additional tactical pouch. And something I forgot to do entirely is to transfer him to the 40mm base, so I was gonna have to rip him clean off. And out of the 2 options, I somehow held on to the wrong one. To avoid this commando face planting in any more tables, I did make sure to apply a generous amount of sprue glue. While he made a tactical landing and absorbed the impact with his face, next time he might not be so lucky. As my commando is cunning and brutal, not brutal and cunning, I attached some stick bombs to the tower to ensure some tactical mayhem. And after priming this proper looking boss, it was time to make the tough decision, which is to figure out how exactly am I actually going to paint him. For my paint job, when I started painting my orcs, I decided to go with the contrast method, as orcs just have a very large amount of units and contrast paints work incredibly well on them. However, afterwards, I want to try providing some additional details and just ensure that his muscles are just even more crazy and just pop out from the rest of the miniature. Mixing in Imperial Fist yellow as well as Militarum green to create a very interesting orc flesh color. It's a very fast way to get some really cool orc looking flesh, and personally I really enjoy it. Next up, using Black Templar for all of the metallic areas. As my color scheme is also goth inspired, I'll be applying it to his clothes as well. With snakebite leather for the backpack as well as all of the leather straps that are on the model. Next up, I applied Blood Angels red, but it's actually supposed to be Flesh Tears red, but I do correct it later on. Next up, I'll be using some Imperial Fist on its own. With this, applying it only to the forward areas that are not obscured by shadows. If you're noticing that my contrast paints are going on particularly smooth, is because I always dip my paintbrush in some flow improver. This essentially makes sure that it doesn't dry on when you're working with the contrast paints and makes it just a tiny amount smoother. For my metallic, I'll be using Vallejo Metal Color Gunmetal Gray, doing very crude edge highlighting on my armor panels, as well as generating a little bit of weathering. With orcs, I always like to create the idea that all of their stuff is very heavy and worn down, applying the exact same weathering to the gun as I'm imagining he gets to smash a lot of things with it. For the satellite tower, I mixed in very bright orange paint thinking I could get a really cool interesting rust color, but all it did was just look very gold, so I ended up covering up with black paint. This is a bonus step of airbrushing some Militarum green from underneath to provide some additional cold shadows. Finally, I also corrected my mistakes with Flesh Tears red. I also thought the model could use a little bit more balance with the red colors, so I added some to the weapon as well as the grenades in the tower. This was the step when I mixed in some of my contrast paints with a little bit of ice yellow from Vallejo, and started testing out the idea of highlighting the muscles, in order to accentuate them even more. And then going over with the thin glaze of the contrast to bring back the saturation. The idea behind this is that by providing the contrast layer on top of the previous color, I don't have to worry about the saturation of the paint itself. I also don't have to worry about matching the colors exactly to the rest of my orcs, as he'll look very similar. An interesting byproduct of doing this is because of every single contrast layer, I'm also smoothing out the transitions between the highlights. And this already was making his muscles just pop a lot more and just look more interesting. However, I wanted to use some Pterodon turquoise to provide some very cold looking shadows by mixing into my previous contrast mix. I didn't apply it to the entire model, and I focused mainly on the areas that were shadows. I then mixed up a very desaturated looking orange to create the idea for his lips. I really enjoyed how it was turning out, so I thought it'd be a pretty cool idea to do just a very subtle glaze over his muscles. With orcs having red blood, I also thought it'd be very interesting to provide the idea that the areas that are very stretched thinly, you can see the red blood. With that, I felt really satisfied with how his skin turned out. Even though I thought about just leaving them as the contrast paint itself, I thought by giving them some additional highlights, I could just make them look a little bit more interesting. To balance out the massive amount of red in the model, I gave him some blue goggles. Not to mention, an Ork Kommando can always use a bit of extra luck. I felt the weapon was looking a little bit flat, so I took some of the Black Templar paint and reapplied it over the metallic. And with that, this incredible looking orc was finally done. The most interesting part about him is because I can use him as either an Ork Kommando boss or alternatively as a Snake Rot. I think this would be a really interesting proxy just as an alternative for him. Not to mention, it has my own special little twist on him. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed these videos, consider joining the Patreon. There's not much there at the moment, but it'll be supporting the channel, and hopefully in the future, I'll be adding some additional content there just to make it more interesting. So, I'll see you next time.